Today we have this question: state the name of the final, that is an important word, products of digestion in each of the following types of nutrients. So they want the final product of carbohydrate, protein, and fat digestion. Digestion of our food begins in the mouth, continues in the stomach, and is completed in the small intestine. The purpose of the large intestine is simply to absorb water and to pass undigested material as feces. Now, carbohydrates is really an umbrella term. It is an umbrella term for polysaccharides such as starch, glucose, and cellulose, disaccharides such as maltose, sucrose, and lactose, as well as monosaccharides, glucose, fructose, and galactose. The end product of all carbohydrate digestion would be the monosaccharide group, right? Which is the simplest digestible form. That is the purpose of digestion, to take insoluble food and break it down such that the food is soluble and can be absorbed into the body. Protein digestion will give us amino acids, and fat digestion will give us glycerol and fatty acids. So what we have on your right would be the end product, or the final product of all digestion. Back to the question. For my answer, the most popular monosaccharide is glucose. So you can make an argument that the end product for carbohydrate digestion, glucose, is a fair answer because it's the most common monosaccharide. I will also include the word monosaccharides, again because carbohydrate is an umbrella term. So I want to just mention that the end product of carbohydrate digestion would be monosaccharides, which include a lot of different things. There's no need to list every single option. We'll list the most popular one, which is glucose. For the protein and fat, our end products are a little simpler, right? Protein will be amino acids, fat will be fatty acids and glycerol. In addition to the macronutrients listed in A, there's 3 other nutrients in a diet that will promote the maintenance of good health. Now this is fairly straightforward. There are 7 nutrient groups. Carbohydrates, fats, and proteins are what you call your macronutrients, which are needed in large quantities. In smaller quantities, you're going to need vitamins and minerals. Water and fiber are also important. Right? Fiber is important for proper gut functioning. Water is important for hydration and life. So these are your options. So on to this question. Mary is a diabetic, but her husband Marvin is not. Explain how the concentration of sugar in Marvin's blood is kept within the normal range several hours before and after he eats a carbohydrate meal. So they want an explanation as to how his blood glucose levels are maintained before he eats and after he eats, for a total of 6 marks. So we're looking at 3 marks apiece, roughly. And that is what we're going to keep in mind as we answer this question. Your blood glucose levels are maintained by 2 hormones working together, insulin and glucagon. So these are your hormones working together here. Right? Insulin works by removing blood glucose, right, and having it stored as glycogen in the liver or muscles. Right? Glucagon is antagonistic. It does the opposite. When your blood glucose levels begin to fall, glucagon signals the liver to convert glycogen back into glucose and release it into the bloodstream. So insulin lowers the glucose levels in the blood. Glucagon increases them if need be. So when you haven't eaten, glucagon is the hormone that prevents your blood sugar from falling too low. Right? It uses the glycogen stored to boost your blood glucose levels. After you've eaten, your blood sugar tends to be high, and in a normal functioning adult, the insulin will signal the liver again to absorb or remove glucose from the bloodstream and store it as glycogen temporarily. One thing to point out that blood glucose falls within a range. It is very difficult for the body to maintain an exact value, so there will be some fluctuation. At times, it may produce too much glucagon and the levels will begin to rise slowly. And if it goes beyond a certain point, insulin will be produced and it will begin to fall again. And as it falls, there will be a signal to release glucagon for it to rise once more. Both insulin and glucagon are produced by the pancreas. This is how I would attempt to answer the question for 3 marks. The blood glucose levels will be determined largely by the hormone glucagon produced and secreted by the pancreas. Notice a few things. I identify glucagon as a hormone. I identify the hormone that is largely acting. Now, in reality, both glucagon and insulin will be working together, but without eating a meal, glucagon is a major hormone. We don't have the space to speak about both. So, before the meal, glucagon would be the major hormone involved in ensuring that the blood glucose levels don't fall too far. Beyond this, right, we also want to mention that the pancreas is the organ responsible for producing the glucagon. Right? So what is the concern? That the glucose levels will begin to fall. And if your blood glucose levels begin to fall, there are a lot of ill effects. Don't need to get into that, but you can lose consciousness. Glucagon is secreted into the bloodstream and travels to the liver. The liver is important to mention. Right? It's also useful to mention that the glucagon gets to the liver via the bloodstream. That is also key. Right? The liver is a site of most of the glucose control. Right? Here it will cause the glucose cells to convert glycogen back into glucose, which is released into the system. So you also need to mention the conversion that occurs, glycogen back into the glucose. So you could think of the liver, well, in reality, liver and muscles, you could think of the liver and muscles as a short-term store of glucose, but in the form of glycogen. Right? Now, what happens after a carbohydrate meal? So, first thing I want to mention here, quickly, in my answer, is that the carbohydrates are digested to produce glucose, and that glucose is absorbed into the bloodstream. And I'm going to mention that this occurs at the ileum. Debatable whether we need details about the digestion in this answer, but wouldn't hurt to mention, right? But I just want to say that is make sure I include that carbohydrates are broken down into glucose, and that gets into the bloodstream. Okay? So this causes an increase in blood glucose levels. We don't want to increase in blood glucose levels. To mention quickly, right? In elevated blood glucose levels, one of the main problems with it is that it does a lot of capillary damage. And that is why we have a lot of problems in vision. Right? We have kidney failure in diabetes, and we have loss of limbs. It's really the capillary damage that causes a lot of the problems associated with diabetes, which one of the main causes is elevated glucose levels. To limit the increase, we do not want our blood glucose levels elevated for extended periods. To limit the increase, The pancreas, again I mentioned, which organ produces insulin, right? Which travels to the liver via the blood. Again I mention it, right? It's a separate question. Mention it again quickly. The insulin, what does the insulin do? It causes the liver cells to remove the glucose from the blood and store it as glycogen. These are the main things that you want to have mentioned in this answer. Explain why Mary is advised to limit her consumption of simple carbohydrates. Now, they did emphasize simple carbohydrates, which are your monosaccharides, disaccharides. So it includes sugar, drinks, snacks, fruit to a certain extent. The difference between fruit and, let's say, chocolate, right, is that fruit includes fiber, and fiber slows the absorption of glucose, which helps you to control your blood glucose levels, whereas chocolate or a snack or a soft drink has no fiber. So that lack of fiber causes a surge in glucose levels, right, which is dangerous, which is Mary, who is diabetic, will have problems dealing with a surge of sugar. Right? So that is the reason they emphasize simple carbohydrates. They're talking about your soft drink, your sugar, your snacks. Right? These things are digested quickly, whereas your complex carbohydrates that are full of fiber will digest a lot slower and will give your body time to deal with the increase in levels. So that is why they included that word there, simple carbohydrates. Mary is diabetic. There are two types of diabetes, type 1, type 2. Type 1 diabetes is a result of an autoimmune disorder, sometimes genetic, where the pancreas itself is destroyed and the body is unable to produce insulin. That's not what most people who are diabetic fall under. Most people who are diabetic fall under type 2 diabetes, and which is linked to obesity. What happens in type 2 diabetes is your body may still produce the insulin, but because of the excess weight, your body is not responding to the insulin anymore. Because fat is a long-term store of glucose. Yeah? So it's the body's way of saying we have enough stored, not interested in storing anymore. But again, the elevated glucose levels are going to cause a lot of damage. So it is a concern. So this is why the diabetic needs to control their glucose consumption, because the body no longer responds to glucose in the same way. So you want to limit the amount of carbohydrates, particularly simple carbohydrates. So this is the answer that I want. Mary is diabetic, which means either she does not produce enough insulin or does not respond normally to insulin. So the first thing I did was explain what is Mary's problem, or what is her condition in terms of carbohydrates. What does it mean? It means that her body does not remove glucose from the bloodstream effectively. So as described what her condition, what is the problem with the condition, and what is the complication, and why is this partially a solution. Reducing simple carbohydrates will help in keeping her blood glucose levels normal, right? You could also say it could prevent her blood glucose levels from becoming elevated, right? Which is a bit more specific, probably what I should have. And that's the end of this question. So just to emphasize the last point, a better answer would probably be, right, that reducing simple carbohydrates will help in avoiding elevated glucose levels, which is a bit more specific than what I had previously, which is this keeping normal levels. You want to be as specific as possible. in your answers. A lot of times students believe that they're vague, that they will get the benefit of the doubt. That is not something you want to gamble with. Right? Be specific.